Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from today. My name is Ida Hyllested, and I'm the Regional Child Rights and Business Manager at UNICEF's Regional Office for East Asia and the Pacific. I have the great pleasure to be moderating today's conversation on the state of child rights and business in East Asia and the Pacific. For this, as you can see, we're joined by a great lineup of speakers and experts who will help us shed light on the ways that business impact on children's rights in this region, how the understanding of business responsibility towards children's rights have evolved, and we'll also have a chance to discuss the role of different duty bearers and stakeholders in addressing and mitigating the negative impacts on child rights. I will be introducing the speakers as we go along, but before I hand over to our first set of speakers, I'd like to place this session in the context of the overall theme of this year's Forum on Responsible Business and Human Rights. The celebration of the 10-year anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the next decade of action, both in relation to the UN Guiding Principles as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. But next year we have another big anniversary coming up, that of the Children's Rights and Business Principles. In the same way that the UN Guiding Principles have changed so much in our understanding of business accountability for human rights, so has the Children's Rights and Business Principles been instrumental in changing the way we conceptualize and articulate child rights issues and impacts in the context of business policies, processes, and decision-making. Businesses impact on the full spectrum of rights defined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as other relevant international standards. And it links to issues such as product formulation, sales and marketing, environmental impacts, land acquisition, employment practices, the way employees behave, data mining, investments, and so forth. However, so often these impacts are a blind spot for business, and instead only the issues that are perceived as creating a risk for business, such as child labor or trafficking, is on the business radar. In this session, we want to take a look at the wide range of business impact on children and young people in this region and make the link to what responsible business conduct looks like, including the role of companies, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and government policy in creating lasting change for children. But now let me turn to our first set of speakers in this session, who will help us set the scene on child rights and business specifically as it applies to East Asia and the Pacific. We have Larissa Isa-Udidi, an associate partner with Dalberg Advisors, the global economic development and social impact advisory firm. And I've recently had the great pleasure to work with Larissa as part of a research collaboration on the impacts of COVID-19 on business in Asia Pacific that also focused on the direct and indirect impacts on child rights. And our second speaker is Nina Vollmer, who is the research manager at Global Child Forum, the non-for-profit organization established by the royal family in Sweden to advance children's rights. And Nina oversees the benchmark studies published by Global Child Forum and Boston Consulting Group. And she's most recently been leading the work on the Southeast Asia benchmark report, which we're going to hear a lot more about now. So to kick us off, I'm going to invite both of you to tell us a little bit more about those research projects you've been involved in, and also your main findings in terms of how business in the region have been impacted by the ongoing pandemic and the implication for children and their families. Nina, let's start with you. Can you tell us a bit more about your work and the benchmark study for East Asia? Over to you.
Of course. So just to clarify, do you want me to, because we have two studies actually, one on COVID-19 and one on the benchmark. So which one would you like me to go first on? So I follow the...
You can start on the COVID study on the pandemic, and then we can deep dive into the benchmark. Thank you, Nina.
Excellent. Sorry about that. So yes, we actually did a study together with Elevate in a conjunction with our Southeast Asia benchmark to understand more about what the impact on children from the pandemic has been, because the data that we collected with the benchmark naturally was a little bit older, and we were very keen to understand this dynamic as well. So basically, from that study, we found mainly three things in terms of the impact on children and connection to large businesses in the region. So one of the main impacts is, of course, the loss of jobs for parents, and that coupled with interrupted education because of school closures, we see, and this is actually from UNICEF and ILO numbers and research, that there is a tangible risk for rise in child labor as a consequence of this. But also, of course, that there is a generation of children now that has been out of school for very long, and many of these children might never return. And where we see the company can support in that is by supporting education initiatives, providing education to vulnerable groups among children, but also access generally to the internet, which we have seen is one of the factors that children have not been able to receive education, and access to schools, depending on what type of operations you're running. The second impact that we see has to do with workplace closures, and the fact that many young people in the region get their work life experience from apprenticeships and internships. And with workplace closures, industries and offices closing down, many of these have been interrupted. So as an example for a figure is that in the Philippines, 3/4 of the internships and apprenticeships were interrupted last year because of this. And here companies, of course, then can work to, as soon as possible, resume these kind of training programs, and also ensure that maybe give a little bit more space for youth as we go forward. Because youth employment, we have seen that already has had it has had a greater impact on youth unemployment than on adult unemployment, if you say. And finally, with the economic downturn, we also see that there is a risk, and this is something that happens usually, is when finance is scarce for companies, what usually goes first are the charities and the programs, which sort of lose funding. And we see that, and we'll come back to this, but in the benchmark, we see that this is something that a lot of Southeast Asian companies are doing, is actually supporting children in the community in different ways. And we haven't been able to collect this data yet, but there is a risk that some of these programs have been affected.
Thanks so much for this, Nina. And so let me hand over to Larissa, who's been focusing specifically on micro and small and medium enterprises as part of her research. So can you complement what Nina mentioned in terms of way that companies are impacted and implications for children and families? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ida and Nina. It's interesting to complement, and part of why we chose to focus the study on MSMEs was really to highlight where are we seeing similarities in terms of the impact that's happening through larger companies and smaller ones, and where is the situation a bit different in terms of the impact and also in terms of what you would expect in terms of a response. So I'll first say that when looking at MSMEs in Asia, they've certainly been hit disproportionately hard from a size perspective. The surveys came out sort of mid last year for Asia, showing that half of the MSMEs surveyed foresaw losing half of their profits that year, whereas only a quarter of large businesses felt the same. So definitely a large correlation between size and the economic impact. In the short term, of course, I think fairly similarly to what Nina said, the disruption to products and services was quite acute, and we saw that. But as lockdowns have been released, but also countries have learned how to deal with the situation, the long-term impact that we found really was from the wages and the layoffs, and especially important on the MSME side, given that a majority of the population is employed by these small businesses. So I won't go into the details of sort of the data and the economics of losses across the businesses, because I think we all sort of saw and felt how serious that was. In terms of the translation to impact on children, though, when we think about that, one that we saw fairly clearly in the evidence was around nutrition. So seeing sort of millions of additional children being pushed into food insecurity as a result of the economic stress. Also sort of millions increased in terms of suffering from wasting. Education, we've already talked about, so increases in inequality and access, and also quality of education given the need to shift online, combined with the economic stress. And then an interesting one is mental health, where there's been sort of less comprehensive data, but certainly evidence to suggest that the added economic pressures are leading to increased incidences of issues there. And maybe the last thing I'll just say, again, the comparison between MSMEs and larger companies is that, I think we all know most MSMEs are not already offering their employees extra benefits, and most MSMEs are not engaged in any kind of corporate social responsibility, as one would expect. And so those natural places where you would usually trim down if you were a larger business are not really open as options to MSMEs. And so the economic impact is really just directly passed on with very little buffer to the families and children of the employers.
Thank you so much, Larissa. And it's great to have these two complementary studies that has come out at the same time. And so coming back to the work of Global Child Forum, and particularly the benchmark study, Nina, can you tell us a bit more about how the largest companies and what you've seen in the benchmark study in terms of how the largest companies are addressing children's rights in their operations and communities?
Of course. So the benchmark that we did, just to give you a little bit of a background as to sort of what we know anything about, is we looked at the 270 approximately largest companies in the region. And when I say region, I'm talking about Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore. For size we use revenue. And so across these largest companies, we use 27 indicators based on the children's rights and business principles to look at how companies disclose on how they address their impact on children's lives in different ways. And we score those disclosures. So we cover a range of child rights issues, child labor is included, but we also go quite beyond that. And just finally to say that we measure company disclosures, but we don't have the possibility of actually measuring the impact on children through this. So we're looking at what companies say they do. And then when we look at the bulk of Southeast Asian companies, something that really stands out, I think, is in what I mentioned before, is that we see that 83% of the companies in the study actually do have some kind of program or support charities that benefit children, which is a lot higher than, for example, the global averages that we see. So we really see that Southeast Asian companies do consider children as important and sort of spend both communication resources and economic resources on children in the community. What we might not see as much, though, is the more integrated perspective that you might want to see in terms of actually considering how is my company impacting children's lives with what we do in our day-to-day operations. And particularly that comes across when we look at issues such as responsible marketing or product responsibility, which have quite low scores all over. This is, however, also reflected in the global study, so it's not something that is particular for the Southeast Asian companies, but it is also present here. If we look at different sectors and compare them, what we also see is that companies who have a more direct or more natural interaction with children tend to score higher. Sometimes these are also companies that have a higher risk of a negative impact, such as palm oil companies. And it's also been in discussions, or sort of there has been quite a lot of spotlight put on these kind of companies for child rights impacts in different ways. We also see that, for example, telecommunications companies are quite good overall, although of course within the sectors there's quite a big spread. So there are leaders and laggards within each of the sectors that we have looked at. And there are also, in the report, we have some case studies of particular companies that one can look at if you want to see sort of what these companies have done particularly. What we also see in trends in terms of, because we did a similar study back in 2016, is that we see that progress has been made in the region. So the average score has almost doubled, which is a really positive finding, we think. What we see, however, is that we started out from a pretty low starting point. So even if the score has doubled, there's still some really important points to keep on working on, and that has to do with what I mentioned before in terms of actually thinking about how the business impact children in terms of risks for child labor, community impact, sort of our children's environment impacted in different ways. For example, their possibility to play, or risks around logistics and sites, and of course then products and marketing. And we see, for example, to take child labor as the example, because that is where we see the most reporting from companies still. There is also the tendency that companies report quite a lot on what they want to do and policies and sort of commitments. But as we sort of go further down the implementation of that, we see less and less reporting. So even if you have a policy, we don't know how you're actually having that come into play within your company. How are you putting that into practice? And even less in terms of reporting on whether that was a success or not. Or, for example, one of the GRI reporting requirements, or sort of within one of the standards, is to report on whether you found instances of child labor or if you see a risk of child labor. And this kind of reporting is really low, both globally, but even more so in the region. So this sort of commitment reporting gap is something that we would really encourage companies to take a look at.
Thanks so much, Nina, for this comprehensive overview of the benchmark report, and so interesting. And I really appreciate the findings that you highlight as well, and the need to maybe to move the needle a bit in this region in terms of going beyond the community investments towards addressing your child rights due diligence, and really making sure that adequate steps are taken to understand, address, and mitigate child rights impacts by company policies and practices and operations. I just have one quick follow-up question, because when I was looking through the report just the other day, I was very curious about this one specific finding that's also been highlighted on your website, in terms of that you're seeing this correlation between companies that are reporting on child rights and those involved in human rights violations or controversies. If you want to add a few more thoughts to that, that would be really interesting for us to hear.
Sure, and it is, as you say, a sort of a very interesting finding, and something that might feel a little bit counterintuitive, that if you get a high score in the benchmark, you should probably not be involved in these kinds of controversies, as they say, sort of reported human rights violations. So what we did was that we took data from an external party, from Sustainalytics, who report on how companies have been involved in violations in different ways, and using secure sort of third-party sources for that. And we correlated that to the benchmark scores. And what we found is that, as you say, not on an individual company sort of basis, but if we group the companies into scoring groups, we can see that the group with the highest scores are also the group that has the most violations reported to it. What we think this has to do with really is, and this is something that can be seen in benchmarking generally, that we measure what companies report, as I said. And the data on violations usually comes in a little bit earlier. So the data on controversies that we used was between a year and 5 years old. And then when we correlate that to the most current reporting, what we think happens is that we sort of capture that companies have actually started talking more about these things when they have been highlighted as problematic in different ways. So just sort of putting it out there and calling companies out also makes them act more and report more on this. And this is what we capture with the benchmark later on. This could, of course, the risk is that this is only reporting and not actually action. But what we do see when we talk to companies who have high scores and have been involved in these kinds of things is that you're usually quite wary of starting reporting on things that you can't actually corroborate. So what we see generally, and of course there might be sort of bad apples among the bunch, but what we see generally is that a company does not report on things that they're not doing. So this is sort of an attempt to explain these relationships, which are of course very complex, and also I think needs a little bit more research, which we plan to do as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely be looking forward to following that research, and thank you so much for sharing this. So I want to take a step back or move into the realm of the micro, small, and medium enterprises, because they of course don't have the same means as the large companies to address some of the impacts that they may have. But Larissa, I would be really keen to hear from you. What do you see are some viable options for MSMEs in this region to address children's rights in this current pandemic context?
Yeah, thanks, Ida. And I think you hit the nail on the head, right? It's a tricky question because as important as MSMEs are to the economy, they are in much less of a position to do the things that larger companies can, right? They have less cash savings, and especially post-COVID, lower capacity for business continuity. And then even from an influence perspective, right, your average individual SME isn't as powerful as a company, though groups have certainly managed to achieve big things. So all to say, I'll be very honest up front and say that anything MSMEs do is going to require quite a bit of support from other actors. To think that MSMEs will be able to tackle this on their own is a bit unrealistic. And so, without going into the details of the economic support that is being provided for MSMEs, that is absolutely critical. I think beyond that, though, we're thinking about what SMEs, and I've kind of taken the micro part out of that because I would actually set them aside as not a place to start. But thinking about SMEs as employers and then SMEs as providers of services and products. So on the employer side, we really did double down on this concept of family-friendly policies, because even if SMEs can't control the economics that they find themselves in, what we all need, quite frankly, at this time is a bit more flexibility and care at work to deal with a range of issues happening both at work and at home. And so I think it becomes even more important to really crack this idea of what does it look like to do this well as an SME? What is realistic? So I think we have a fairly broad sense of what some of these policies look like across companies, but really translating that into what are the sort of 2 or 3 things that an MSME can actually action. And then alongside that, what kind of technical support is required, what kind of government standards are required, and in fact, government incentives to adopt some of these. So that's a big one that we focused on in the report. And then maybe I'll just quickly speak to the idea of SMEs as providers of services and products. I think there are some really exciting areas where SMEs can actually be a bit more forward-leaning in terms of finding new ways to serve underserved populations. And I'll be the first to say this won't apply to all sectors, and even within relevant sectors, it will not apply to the majority of SMEs. But the few who are able to do this and sort of drive this innovation can have a really outsized impact from a child rights perspective. And so I think some of the sectors or areas that we thought about in this are food and nutrition, education, and mental health, which actually overlap quite nicely with the areas that we saw impacts on. So, in the education space, certainly seeing EdTech, a lot of those are SMEs driving that innovation, and we're going to need to see more of that going forward. And even some really interesting things coming up in terms of mental health and digital services as well, typically driven by smaller businesses. So it is the more forward-leaning, ambitious aspect of what a subset of SMEs can do, but I think it's important to think about those businesses as part of the broader solution in that context as well.
Thank you so much, both Larissa and Nina. This is excellent and really sets the stage for us and the following conversation. And all of what you touched upon will come back again Also, as we hear from Professor Surya in terms of government public policy and action and regulation and the work of multi-stakeholder initiatives such as RSPO. And we'll also hear from Delta Electronics Thailand, which is one of the companies that was benchmarked in the GCF report. So a lot more to continue along the same thread. But for now, I'd like to zoom in on some of the impacts and experiences on the ground. And of course, this is such a diverse region that we are in with so many different issues and impacts, but we're fortunate today to be joined by 3 women with very unique knowledge and insights about the situation of children and young people across different industries. And our speakers are Ms. Ines Kempfer, the CEO of the Center for Child Rights in Business, a very seasoned and passionate child rights advocate who brings more than 10 years of experience in CSR supply chain management with a strong focus on Asia's manufacturing industry. And I'm especially pleased to welcome Ms. Huong, who is a young worker in a furniture factory in Dong Nai, Vietnam. And Ms. Huong will tell us more about her journey from being involved in a hazardous work situation to being part of a youth development program in a factory. And last but not least, we will have Ms. Kamini Viswanathan, human rights consultant with Insight Consultancy. And Kamini was until recently the Human Rights and Social Standards Manager for RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. And Kamini led the development of RSPO standards, policies, and guidance related to human rights from 2016 onwards. She's recently left the RSPO, but we're so fortunate that she can join us here today and also speak to all the work she did with RSPO. But so Kamini, let me start with you. You have a lot of experience working with different stakeholders in the palm oil sector. Can you tell us more about your work in this sector and the ways that you have seen children and young people being impacted in this sector? Over to you.
Sida. It's actually really interesting because the session before, as you pointed out, really set the background for what's happening right now. And with us, like in the work that I've done in the RSPO, you would have seen like we started off, our point of departure was back in 2014 or 2016, where the focus was really on child labor and, you know, what are the impacts around child labor. But thanks to a study that was done by UNICEF, which looked into the impacts of the palm oil industry on children in both Malaysia and Indonesia, we've identified that, you know, there's so many other root causes that goes into the situation. So a child doesn't end up, you know, working, or a young person doesn't end up working because they want to, right? There's so many issues that leads towards it. And, you know, there were 7 impact areas that were discovered, and those were child protection, child labor, of course, education, maternity protection and breastfeeding, childcare, health and nutrition, and finally, water, sanitization and hygiene. So that was the point of departure for us, because we figured out that, hey, if we don't want to see children on plantation or children working in dangerous and hazardous conditions, what we need to do is we need to take care of the family first. We need to see how are the mothers being protected. We need to see how the family is being taken care of. So using that as a point of departure, what we did was we identified, or we zoned in into those areas as well to see, you know, what are those impacts. And we realized that, you know, having issues of wage discrepancies, looking at situations where there's just not enough childcare to go around, opportunities for women to work. And we saw that these root causes were very important to address. And because of that, I think we went down and we started looking at, you know, where should our energy be focused in when we were looking at the RSPO or looking at the interventions that RSPO can work with. And that's when we realized that, okay, if we were going to do something about this, we need to look and address the root causes. So yes, of course, you know, RSPO has a no child labor policy, but beyond that, what could we do further? And I think that was a very pivotal point, or a very important moment with the RSPO when we started looking at the principles and standards that RSPO members need to comply with in order to be able to produce sustainable palm oil. And we looked at our principles and criteria in a very holistic manner. And we saw that, okay, there were so many aspects that we needed to identify, which you wouldn't see the word child rights or child safety or you know, or child labor imprinted on it, but it looked into issues like no discrimination, what kind of benefits are being provided to the workers? Are they being provided a decent living wage? Because if you are provided a decent living wage, then the assumption is that you do not need another source of income, and therefore children do not have to be at work. What are the access to education? What are the companies doing in order to be able to provide these benefits? So it was a very holistic approach that the RSPO had taken, and that had resulted in the RSPO Principles and Criteria 2018 that you see today. And I think what's important to mention here is that although it's not a perfect solution, but we do see that the companies are taking very inserted efforts towards making the environment of the workspace or the plantation environment sustainable for children to work and thrive. Sorry, not to work, for children to thrive in. And as we've seen or we've heard from the previous studies, the efforts are reflected in the impacts that are being delivered right now.
Thank you so much, Camino. So interesting to hear this experience specifically from the palm oil sector. So I want to invite Ines to complement that with all her work in the manufacturing sector and specifically also the garment and footwear sector across the region. If you can further complement and elaborate on some of the impacts that you see on children and young people and their families from your work.
Thanks so much, Ida. Thanks for this interesting input report. And one big difference when we look at air manufacturing and
there's a problem
horticulture.
with your audio. Sorry, I don't hear you. I don't know if the others can hear you.
Work all the time. Let me try to take my head. Can you hear me now?
No, it's a distorted voice coming through.
I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry at all. Why don't
Is it?
I would suggest, why don't we see if we can get the tech people to support you, and you may have to re-log in for this. And then instead, what I'll do is I'll move to Huong to talk about her journey, and then we can come back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, you want to continue with Armenia, and then
I will continue with Huong, and if you can log out and re-log in, I think that's what's needed. I'm so sorry. So we'll hear a lot more from Ines shortly, but I'll ask her to log out and log back in because it's a distorted sound coming in my end, and I assume that may be the same for the audience as well. So let's jump straight to Huong, who can help us shed light on the experience of being a young worker, but also someone who's gone from a journey of being in a hazardous work situation and now working in a young worker program that's safeguarding her rights. And Huong has been able to go on this journey through the support of the Center for Child Rights in Business, who started this work in Vietnam. So Ines will be able to tell us more about that when she rejoins as well. But for now, I'll hand it over to Huong, and I will just want to thank you so much to you and your employer, because I know you're joining us from the factory setting right now. We'll also have a simultaneous translator who's going to join us now and to support the translation of what Huong have to share with us. So if we can get Tang on the screen as well, so then we can have the two of them. Over to you, Huong.
Xin chào, em tên là Phan Thị Mỹ Hường. Xin chào, em tên là Phan Thị Mỹ Hường, năm nay em 19 tuổi, đến từ Long An, Việt Nam. Em đang làm việc tại một nhà máy nội thất và đã làm việc ở đây từ năm 17 tuổi. Công việc của em là công nhân canh chỉnh cỡ. Ngoài giờ làm việc, em dành thời gian để nấu ăn, chăm sóc gia đình. Và sở thích của em là nghe nhạc và đi chơi với bạn bè.
Oh, my name is Huong. I'm 19 years old and from Long An, Vietnam. I'm working for a furniture factory and have been working here since I was 17 years old. My job at the moment is a trick setup worker. Outside working hours, I spend time to cook and take care of my family, and my hobby is listening to music and going out with my friends.
Trước khi vào nhà máy á, thì sau khi học lớp 9 thì em nghỉ vào năm 2018. Vì gia đình không cho phép điều kiện. Sau đó em chỉ học ở nhà phục vụ gia đình. Những việc lặt vặt khác, em cùng cha mẹ làm nhiên trong một khoảng thời gian kinh tế gia đình. Công việc khá vất vả, thường xuyên ngồi xuống đứng lên nhiều lần và làm từ sáng tới tối. Nó đòi hỏi phải làm cẩn thận, tỉ mỉ. Nếu làm sai phải làm lại từ đầu. Ngoài ra khi làm em còn tiếp xúc với bụi nhang. Khi hít phải thì rất khó chịu. Em rất mong có được công việc ổn định và phù hợp với bản thân cho gia đình cho phép. Em ở nhà làm nhiên được 1 năm rồi xin vào làm tại nhà máy.
After finishing my grade 9 in 2018, I dropped out of school because our family could not afford it. And then I just stay at home to support my family with house chores and other stuff. And I also help my parents to do incense sticks to make our family finance better. And this job was quite hard because I usually squatted on the ground and work from the morning to the evening every day. It required a lot of carefulness because I had to start over again if something went wrong. And besides, I had to break in the incense powder and it was very irritated. I really hope for a better and safer job to support my family. I was doing the incense sticks for 1 year and then applied to the current factory.
Sau khi vào nhà máy em được cha em là công nhân tại nhà máy nội thất, giới thiệu vào đây làm giữa năm 2019. Khi cha em nghe đến có chương trình hỗ trợ cho thanh thiếu niên ở độ tuổi của các em được thực hiện tại nhà máy. Khi đó em 17 tuổi, em được sắp xếp và làm việc ở bộ phận đóng rối và làm những công nhân việc nhẹ nhàng với độ tuổi của em. Em được làm với thời gian hợp lý và có thêm thời gian để dành cho gia đình và bạn bè. Tại nhà máy em được làm quen với những người bạn mới trong chương trình và được các anh chị công nhân quản lý lớn hơn bảo nhiệt tình. Ngoài việc được các anh chị chỉ dẫn về kỹ năng và cụ thể công việc, em còn được học thêm những kỹ năng mềm, chăm sóc và bảo vệ bản thân, quản lý chi tiêu mà em thấy rất bổ ích cho cuộc sống hiện tại và sau này của em. Hiện tại vì em đủ 18 tuổi nên được sắp xếp làm một công việc đòi hỏi kỹ năng cao hơn và em vẫn đang học để làm tốt hơn. Em cảm rất biết ơn nhà máy và chương trình vì tạo điều kiện để cho em một công việc ổn định, được đào tạo có định hướng nghề nghiệp. Như ngày hôm nay, em sẽ tiếp tục phấn đấu để trở thành công nhân tốt hơn trong tương lai.
I was introduced here by my father, who is also a worker here in mid-2019. When he heard about a youth development program for youth at my age implemented at the factory. I was 17 years old back then. I was arranged to work at the packing department and work on suitable jobs for my age. My working hours was reasonable, so I had more time for my family and my interests. I had a chance to meet new friends who also participated in the program at the factory, and I was also instructed by other idle workers and supervisors. Besides the work skill, I also learned the soft skills such as my personal health protection or personal finance management that was very useful for my well-being. And after reaching the age of 18, I was arranged for another job which required higher skills, and I'm still learning to do it better. I feel grateful for the factory and the youth development program for creating an opportunity for me to have a stable job, being trained, and being well-oriented. I will keep trying to be better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huong, for sharing this wonderful journey that you've been on and to hear about the opportunities you now have through this youth development program. It's fantastic to hear that this is possible. Of course, it requires the investment of the factories and of the companies. And I was listening to one of the youth employment sessions just before this session as well. And this, need for more of these kind of programs is something that comes through very loud and clear. So it's great to hear about your experience. I want to ask if we have Ines back, and we do. And can we hear you, Ines?
Hi, can you hear me?
We hear you perfectly. So thank you for rejoining us. I was worried. So
yeah,
Huong
me too.
shared,
I don't know why. Okay, so sorry, go ahead, Rita.
Huong has shared her journey with us, and I also mentioned how this was a program that was initially supported by the Center for Child Rights in Business. But I want to come back and for you to tell us more about what you've seen in terms of impacts on children and young workers and the families in the manufacturing sector and footwear and garment sector, and also the opportunities that exist for companies to support such programs that Huong has been on. Over to you.
Sure. Yeah, so what I tried to say a little bit last time is, obviously the one big difference between agriculture and the manufacturing sector is that it's more formalized. And that in certain areas at least, and particularly in the visible areas, does allow us a certain level of more visibility and control. So I would say, while it's not uncommon, it's definitely true that we have a lower number of children, for example, child labor happening in the manufacturing sector than what we see in agriculture. I think beyond that, to be honest, very quickly it becomes quite similar because children are heavily impacted as well, often indirectly by the working conditions of their parents. We have seen in multiple studies that we have been doing that if parents are, for example, if they have to migrate or if they have extremely long working hours, it affects children's well-being in terms of neglect or being able to be looked after. The parents' wage level have a direct impact also on children of factory workers, on their access to education, their access to healthcare, for example. So if wages are too low, children will not have access to some of those basic rights, and that obviously then has a strong impact on them. And then I think the other very important area where children are impacted, and that's where Huong stories comes in, is the fact that it's very difficult for young workers, and that's children in working age, so somewhere generally between 15 and 17, to find decent work opportunities, meaning that they might have ended school for whatever reason and they're looking for decent work, or they're looking for work, and ideally that would be decent work that protects them, etc. And we basically see in the vast majority of cases, there's two options for those young workers. It's one, they either have to actually go into the informal sector, whether that's kind of subcontracting, smaller workshops, homework, or agriculture, or they somehow manage to stay in the more formal manufacturing sector, but then they're unrecognized, meaning they have fake IDs or different IDs or no IDs. There's different forms, but do not benefit from that special protection that they should receive, given that they are still children. And that is mainly the case because most of the formal manufacturing sector does either quite clearly exclude anyone under 18, saying, we don't want to have the issue to be accused of having child labor or having to deal with that, so we'll just stay away from it. I think officially I think community, that's often the same kind of structure that we see in palm oil, for example. And so these kids are being pushed down because they're out there. There's a lot of children who do not continue school, particularly in these regions, but actually all over the world. It has even become more children with COVID who do not go to continue schooling beyond the mandatory schooling. There's even obviously issues before that, but particularly once mandatory schooling is reached the age of 15, so many kids are out there and looking for other opportunities. And that whole internship vocational school sector in Asia is relatively underdeveloped. So there's not that many opportunities for kids like that, and they're looking for work. And so what the opportunity is for companies is really to proactively engage, such as Huong's factories did, right? And I think with the buyer that was involved in this program, we realized if we don't do something proactively, if the company doesn't go out there and say, well, we actually do have a youth development program, so the young people who apply, who are under 18, they for one can really say I'm under 18, and there's a specific program for them that has already kind of preset positions that we know are non-hazardous. The factories have taken a lot of effort in preparation when we did that the first year to accommodate the young workers, to ensure they're ready, and added on with training activities, etc. And obviously the great thing about that is that this needed some preparation efforts in the first year, but is now run by the factories themselves. And so they're basically contributing to youth development continuously, just on their own, by offering opportunities. And as I think we've heard very nicely from Huong, thank you so much again for sharing, and for the factory for supporting this. So as we've just heard, really making a difference for children or young workers in their lives.
Thank you so much, Ines. And I just, while you're connected, I want to ask you a follow-up question, because I think there are some really great examples here of how companies are taking steps to do some very concrete projects of work or change working conditions to enhance workers who are either parents or caregivers or young workers themselves. But what motivates these companies to do this? Was it the buyers pushing? Was it because of investors looking? What do you see as some of the main drivers behind the companies that are taking that extra step?
Well, in most cases, it's a combination of many things. It certainly helps if buyers have those conversations. I mean, in this particular case, I think the buyer was concerned about discriminating against youth and feeling like, we being very kind of pro-youth in our communication, also back at home, and we feel like we have to be consistent in that approach throughout the supply chain. There is obviously advantages for the business. It's creating your next generation of workers. It's creating a highly skilled workforce, a highly motivated workforce. So I think once the first hurdles were overcome, the factories in these programs very much saw the benefits for their own business as well. And then in some cases, it's also realizing, well, I'm actually doing something really meaningful and really helpful. And we see that a lot of times when we do family-friendly workplaces, we always have to get in with a lot of convincing factors and also a lot of convincing numbers on why this is a good thing. And it is a good thing, and it does promote business. But we also see that there sometimes is a moment where people are actually realizing this is really the right thing to do. So they don't, like factory managers suddenly are like, yeah, it's fine. I don't need to know about the money that I'm going to make. This is a good thing I'm doing. And so we see a shift and we see a combination of value. And I think it's both, obviously it cannot destroy the business. It cannot negatively affect the business. But I think there is also an emotional value and just in just contributing to that. Worker retention, though, is a big one, and if you can, and worker satisfaction, and if we can increase that, I think it's a very beneficial kind of outcome for the business as well. Investors, there is some tendencies, but I still have to come across the factory managers who told me, yeah, the investors are on my back. I think I haven't seen that trickle down to that level. I've seen the discussions on higher levels, etc., and maybe sometimes with the buyers, but not so much with the actual suppliers and production facilities.
Thank you so much. And Camille, I'm going to come back to you when we talk more about specifically RSPO and the multi-stakeholder initiative. But for now, I think this is a nice segue into our next set of speakers. So I'll come back to you. I already see we have some great questions coming up. So I'll bring you all back in again to answer some of the questions. I just want to remind the audience that they can ask questions in the Q&A box that you see on the right side of your screen if you're watching this live on the platform. But since you spoke so eloquently now about the fact that sometimes it just makes sense for business to do and take steps in this way, Ines, it's not necessary that you need the business case always. So I think that's a nice segue into our next line of speakers, which includes a business voice and an expert and advocate for business and human rights accountability and action. So we have KK Chong, who's the head of corporate communication and sustainable development at Delta Electronics Thailand. And Delta Electronics has been engaging on child rights since 2019, and we look forward to hearing more about your journey shortly. And then we're especially honored to be joined by Professor Surya Deva, Associate Professor at the School of Law of City University of Hong Kong and the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So KK, I'm going to start with you. We've heard a lot of good examples from Ines and Kamini, and it would be great to hear from you directly as well about what are some concrete ways or steps that Delta Electronics have taken to better understand child rights, and how have you taken steps to integrate this knowledge into your ways of doing business? Over to you.
Hey, good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Very honored to be part of the panel today. Regarding the question, how Delta actually approach this child right to integrate the knowledge into our ways of doing business. Basically, Delta has always been a strong advocate in terms of sustainable development. So we also know very well in terms of sustainable development, including child's right, it is an ongoing effort and it has been evolving. And fortunately, the company's mission statement is actually to provide innovative, clean, and energy efficient solution for a better tomorrow. And this very short statement itself actually encompasses the whole sustainable development principles, the ESG. So because we also know that these international best practices are always evolving, so we've always been proactively seeking out the best practices in the industry. And this is why we voluntarily have been opening up our efforts to assessment like the CDP, DJSI, and recently to Global Child Forum. And just last year, we have an opportunity to join the workshop by UNICEF and Thailand's Sustainable Business Institute. And this workshop was called the Children's Right KPI Disclosure Mapping to GRI and SDG Principle. And in fact, it was through this workshop that we realized that Child's Right Business Principle Action Mapping into workplace, marketplace, and community and environment can actually, bring to surface a lot of the CSR actions that we have been doing and have already been addressing the children's right either directly or indirectly. So for example, our energy and environmental conservation education, which is done by our volunteers for the children in the community surrounding our factory, and our bursary for our employees' children. And we are also one of the first company to have 100% RoHS compliance products, which has both direct and indirect impact on the product safety for children. So all these areas, through the mapping, we realized that we have actually been doing a lot. And the mapping itself, if we could put this on an SD report, and also to align more closely our human rights policy with the CBRP, we could actually highlight all these efforts of children's right. What's the purpose of that? And apparently it's not just for good business. First and foremost, it provides clarity to our vast amount of CSR action and SD strategy. And then the data and programs as mapped actually provide impactful pictures to skeptics, both internally and externally, on CSR programs, on the differences a company can actually make for our children. It's not just it's not just a sole responsibility of organization like UNICEF. So from our CSR working team perspective, it actually makes our CSR advocacy voice that much louder and more convincing. And with the mapping on our SD report, we hope we can also be a role model for the local and even a regional industry in terms of the areas, again, a company can actually be indirectly or directly be involved as far as children's rights are concerned. So just now Nina mentioned earlier on that many companies are actually unwilling to report or to be accessed for things that they can't or they aren't doing. On the contrary, for us, from Delta perspective, we are more than happy to be assessed. Only through that we can see where our weaknesses are, where our strengths are, And without being assessed, again, going back to my earlier point, we won't know what are the best practices in the industry. So we will just have this, the Chinese saying, a frog in the well perspective. We think we are doing great, but we are only doing so much in comparison to the best practices in the industry. So in June 2020, last year, we officially included the disclosure of CRBP KPI in our SD report. Of course, along the GRI standards also. You guys can, if you are interested, you can see our SD report on our website. And then subsequently, as I mentioned, we have revised our human rights policy to align closer with CRBP. And all these efforts are definitely a very enlightening or rather a sobering part from our side to see that the efforts that we have been doing are actually in the right directions, and there is a lot more that we could be doing. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. Yes. Yeah.
That was very powerful. I think it's really interesting to hear about your journey, and also I'm inspired by what you're saying in terms of yes, it makes business sense for you, partly because you also want to be a role model, but also because you desire critical feedback on your performance so that you can keep improving. And I think that mentality is a very powerful mentality. And I wonder, KK, if you just, for some companies, this seems overwhelming to begin even, they've just familiarized themselves with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And now there's also the children's rights and business principles. And do you have a message to other companies that may be struggling in terms of where to even start?
Children's right principle is very much, it's the epitome of what sustainable development is about. It's an ongoing effort. It's not just doing good, it's literally sustaining a business. If it is an ongoing long-term investment, you can't see, you won't necessarily see the tangible ROI. Yeah. It's very much like marketing. It's very much like advertising. It's you don't get an instantaneous result from it. And this effort is going to be ongoing. So the advice for companies struggling to get started, invest in resources. Yeah, I'm guilty of that also. I believe my team is on the call, so I do wish that I could have a larger team, and this will be happening. And of course, the board of directors in many companies, the shareholders, they are only taught maybe just revenue. Bottom line, top line. I think, again, coming back to the principle of sustainable development, not everything is tangible, but if you want a long-living business that can sustain for decades, 2 years, these are the little investment along the way you have to do. Yeah. If the only consideration is short-term revenue, then that's it. I think it will never get started, let alone that it is such a complex things to do. Yeah. And again, where to start? Join workshops, be assessed. Don't be afraid, to get bad results. I think if no one tells you that, then how are you going to improve? How are you going to know where you're lagging? And precisely, the team, I give the credit to my team that actually joined the workshop and have been paying a lot of attention to map out all this excellent work that they are doing on the SD report. This can only happen because they joined the workshop last year. If they had just think that, wow, I don't want to waste my time on this, I could just search online, Google some basics. I don't think the quality of that mapping can shed any lights that are actually that enlightening to the management, at least. Yeah. So yes, start with being assessed, go join a workshop, invest in resources. I think these 3 points should help struggling company to kick off. Yeah, but of course, determination. Okay, if all they are thinking about is to there's a SD term called greenwash, to greenwash their effort or whatever similar to that concept, then forget about it. Yeah, it will not happen overnight. That you're not going to see benefits overnight. It's impossible. Yeah, that's why it's called sustainable development, and child's right is a crucial part of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that, KK. That's very powerful. So thank you. And I think so. Now we've heard from you about the power of individual business being determined and taking action. And so, Kamini, I want to go back to you and the work you were doing with RSPO, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative involving so many different stakeholders. And if you can tell us a bit more about, what got RSPO started on this child rights agenda. You've referenced the research already, but you've also developed the standards and principles and recent guidance as well. So if you can tell us a bit more about the power of that multi-stakeholder effort, that would be great to hear about.
I think that plays a very big role. I think, as you've rightly pointed out, I think someone pointed out that, suppliers play a role, the markets play a role as well. And I think another important role is the assurance system that a multi-stakeholder organization or multi-stakeholder based organization like the RSPO can give adds more power to any of the initiatives that they're looking at doing, or if you're looking at doing. So to give everyone a general perspective, the RSPO is a membership-based organization which is made out of all the key stakeholders in the palm oil industry globally. So you have your palm oil producers, you have the financial institutions that support the industry, you have the processors and traders, you have the consumer goods manufacturers, the retailers, and finally the social and environmental NGOs. And how it works is that this entire set of stakeholders, they come together and they decide what is this thing called sustainable palm oil. And what happens is that one of the interventions that the RSPO has is via its principles and criteria that I've mentioned just now. How it's done is that we have a set of principles and criteria, and right now we also have a smallholder standard, and this is constantly reviewed every 5 years by the membership themselves, where they prioritize what are the sustainable goals that the industry needs to meet in order to ensure that the oil that is produced is sustainable. So you will see with the framework of the organization itself, the focus is very much from the industry itself. What is the pressures that's coming from the markets? What are the important factors that are being looked at by the watchdogs? They all come together, and it's done in a very participative manner. So in that sense, I think that the space that RSPO really provides, or a multi-stakeholder initiative like the RSPO provides, is it comes together and it prioritizes what is the importance of sustainability to the business. And zoning into the human rights aspect specifically, we have seen that there has been a shift, a great shift really, from the previous standards, the 2013 standards, to the 2018 standards, where in the 2013 standards, we didn't have much priority given to the human rights aspect as how we see it in the 2018. And then, taking that one layer deeper, we look at the children's rights aspect and how it was then integrated into the practices. But I think more importantly, I think we've seen the impacts and how the industry members have taken on to this initiative, or into this, looking into the aspects of the CRBP processes. And so I mentioned just now, like you said, how it was integrated into the standards, and how we've worked with UNICEF in the past. And I think one very important project that we embarked on was one where we started looking into a pilot initiative to look into the impacts and how the industry had integrated what they had found in the study into their systems. So I was quite I think I was quite privileged, because I was able to follow one of these pilot projects where we had actually gone into a plantation and looked at what were the efforts that were already being done in the plantation. So the thing is, there are many efforts that are taken by a lot of the members. You see, like in Indonesia, you see schools being built, and education being provided. opportunities, scholarships being provided to the children. In Malaysia, for instance, where if you're familiar with the Malaysian context, you'll know that the issue of undocumented workers it's a real issue here. And in Sabah especially, what happens is that families come from Indonesia to work in Malaysia, wherein the worker brings along their families, or if a child is born in Malaysia, that child is then undocumented. So therefore, having access to education is a challenge. What we've seen is some companies, they've worked together with NGOs to build schools where children get educated and find means of how they can then carry on the process of legalizing the children or the family of the workers whilst the child or the worker, the child is in Malaysia, and whilst the family, the workers still remain working in the country. So these are quite interesting efforts that are being carried through. But what we also see is that there is a need from the markets. They're looking at things in a very strategic manner. We're looking at shared responsibility. We look at the aspect of it takes an entire village to bring up a child, right? And I think that led to the development of the guidances, which Ines is quite familiar with as well. We realized that it's not just the producers that has the responsibility, that bear the responsibility when it comes to safeguarding risks of the industry or the production of palm oil against the children. You need to look at this whole issue holistically. What are downstream players doing? How are they ensuring that their supply base is free of any risks against children? What should they be requiring from the supply base? With the producers, for instance, what are the efforts that you can look at? What is the risk-based approach that you need to take on? And also, another thing with the RSPO is that we have companies or producers at different scales of production. So you will have the big players, you'll have the Sandabis, you'll have the FGVs of the world, but you'll also have mid-range companies which cannot afford to build schools, for children. So what do they do? What is their point of departure? So it is also very important to take into account what the businesses can actually provide and how can they meet the CRPP requirements within their own scale. So it was very important for us to ensure that we have these guidances that are already at hand for companies to take and look and see, okay, where are we along this journey and how can we start? Where's our point of departure? How do we make sure that we're giving children opportunities? We are not putting them at risk of continuous poverty. How are we putting these building blocks in place? If we find a child working on our plantation, inadvertently, how do we take this child out of this dangerous and hazardous situation? So these are very important factors that, looking at the standards alone, you will not be able to identify, you will not be able to react. And we felt that this was very important because, if you're having something that says no child labor, if you find a child that's on the plantation, you're going to be penalized. But what is the benefit? What's coming out of that? What are we doing to make sure that this situation doesn't occur again? What are we doing to make sure that the child is protected and taken care of? So I think that was the departure points that we were looking at, and I think it's gotten quite a good response. We see many companies now integrating this into their systems and seeing how they can make it work within their own operations to ensure that those impacts are being met. So it's been quite an interesting journey. It's something that I was quite interested in looking at, actually.
Thank you so much, Kamini. Thank you for sharing all this work of RSPO. It's really interesting, and several things that you mentioned leads me into our next speaker, because you mentioned the undocumented workers in Sabah and that it takes a village. And I don't think we can talk about any of this. We can't talk about business and children's rights without considering the role of government and the role of public policy, especially in addressing root causes. And in setting the tone and in regulating business behavior. So I'm very pleased that Professor Surya has joined us and as an expert and also as someone who I think is tracking the trends in terms of what are you seeing in terms of the government action on child rights in business. Please share with us, Surya. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Ida, and I hope you can hear me. and it was very insightful sharing by different panelists. I would like to congratulate them as well. In terms of the government action, what I would like to highlight as a starting point is that we should not have an either-or mindset, that either the government action alone will suffice or the industry action or multi-stakeholder approaches alone will be sufficient in the field of child rights or generally in the field of business and human rights. We need all of this together. And I think that is what I call the integrated approach of regulation. So we need all the players playing their part in a cohesive manner. And if they cohesively act together, play their part, then perhaps we might be able to achieve some of these outcomes. And here we're talking about the outcomes in terms of the children's rights. I would mention 4 concrete examples of government intervention in this particular field. One is the national action plans. So in Asia Pacific, we have 2 countries adopting a standalone action plan, Thailand and Japan. Now, if you look at these 2 documents, they touch upon the rights of children. In particular, the Japanese national action plan, it takes child rights as a cross-cutting issue and tries to address whether it's trafficking of children or sexual exploitation or issues about child labor, promoting the dissemination of the children's rights principles, or looking at the rights of child in the context of sports activities, right? So a range of activities are being proposed by the government. So I mean, the real thing would be that to what extent the government will now translate these commitments into action. I think that is yet to be seen. Similarly, in the Thailand's national action plan, there is something which could be relevant. For instance, they talk about the rights of the children of the migrant workers. And in Thailand, of course, the undocumented workers is a major issue. So the rights of those children who are of these migrant workers, I think that could be a game changer if the government really acts on that. The second, of course, is the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation that are emerging primarily in Europe, but they would have global implications, including for child labor situations in Asia Pacific. We have yet to see the European Commission releasing this law, but of course, it is inevitable that something of this nature will come out later this year. And of course, we already have certain countries in Europe having those legislation. The third action that I would like to mention is that certain countries now increasingly imposing restrictions through customs prohibition and ban. US is a leader on this, so they have imposed customs ban on certain products and services if the child labor or forced labor is involved in those, right? So I think businesses would have to be very careful going forward because the burden is primarily on businesses to prove that there is no child labor, there is no forced labor involved in their production of services or products. So I think that is there. And the fourth and the last is the modern slavery legislation. I think they will also have implications in relation to child rights. And of course, we have already Australia and UK having those legislation. I think these legislations are far from perfect or ideal, but they're a good starting point. And it is very likely other countries in the region, New Zealand, there's a greater push, might enact those legislation going forward. So I think, Ida, I would like to say that government action is crucial. And we see that happening now more and more in recent years across the world. And of course, there's also a process to negotiate a treaty at the international level. So I think these are several thoughts that I wanted to share with you in terms of the relevance to the child rights. What is absolutely vital in my view is this point, that unless the governments act, the actions of other actors will not be sufficient. So the governments have a twin responsibility. One is they have to discharge their obligations under international human rights law. And second, their role of signaling to other actors, whether these are market forces, consumers and investors, or these are businesses. They need to signal to these actors in the marketplaces that, look, human rights are your business as well, and you must take them seriously. I'll stop at this for now.
Thank you so much, Surya. And actually, so we do have a question that's come in because I was going to ask you, what's your vision for how we can work towards a more powerful and transformational agenda for child rights in this region? But I heard what you said, right? It requires all different parties to come together, but most of all governments to take a leadership role in this. But I have one question that's come in specifically around this, so I wanted to ask it to you, and that is, how do we enhance or ensure that there's more accountability on the part of big business when it comes to children's rights? Because so even in Asia Pacific, many of the countries here do have laws and legislation in place, but there's a lack of political will. And there may be patronage politics that affects how the rights of workers, including children, are affected. How can we change that? That's a big question, I realize that, but if you had some thoughts on that in addition, that would be
Yes,
great.
it's a big question. A couple of thoughts. One is that we have to look at the child rights in a holistic sense. Unless we deal with the issues of poverty, inequality, unless we fix the issues of sexual harassment, domestic violence, unless we start paying living wages to the parents of these children, we cannot fix child rights issues in isolation. That is my submission. So first point is this: we need to adopt a holistic, integrated approach to protect the rights of the child. The second point is that we must involve children and the organizations working for their rights in the regulatory paradigms more. Children are not merely recipients. They can also be change makers if we give them the right opportunities. And I think the sharing by Huong demonstrate that. And of course, in other panels, I have heard from these formal child workers how they have been empowered if they were given right opportunities, right? For instance, how do we ensure that children have some kind of an association for collective bargaining, right? We talk about trade unions, but we talk about trade unions for the workers. So what about some kind of a collective platform for these workers? I think someone was talking about 15 to 17 years. They're looking for some decent work opportunities, right? But you need to protect your rights there, right? Can a typical trade union protect their rights? Perhaps no, right? So how do we support those workers to organize collectively and convey that these are the needs that we have, and these needs may be different from what the adults may have, right? So I think those issues are very critical. My last point for now is that we would also need to ensure that businesses go beyond this negative approach of just avoiding no harm. Doing no harm will not be enough. Businesses would need to protect and fulfill the rights of children. I would say for everyone, but this becomes more compelling when we're talking about children. You cannot leave these kids on the streets. Whether this is part of your legal obligation or not, you must be proactive on this, because those could be your future consumers. Those could be your future employees. Those are your future investors, right? And now the COVID pandemic has made thousands, if not millions of children who are orphaned now. They have lost their parents. Who will take care of those? I think businesses would have to come up with some plans and packages to take care of the children who have been in a very difficult situation because of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Surya, and that's very enlightening. And now we have a few questions that's come in for everyone, so I'd like to bring in all the panelists into the one page again. Wonderful to see you all and have you all here. So we have time for a few questions. So the first one that has come in is specifically around benchmark studies that are telling a certain story about global businesses and how they're establishing more sustainable practices and operationalizing child rights commitments. But we still find that there's a lot of adverse impacts on children in the workplace, in the marketplace, or in the community, which remain unaddressed on the ground. But I think the person asking the question has a concern about whether or not we're recognizing these companies globally just for making commitments without actually conducting the impact assessments and due diligence or listening to the voice of the communities. And so the question is, how can we reconcile this understanding between the local and the global? and what needs to be done for better local corporate performance with regards to the rights of children who are invisible for big corporations. So maybe I could start by inviting Nina, if you want to start out, and then I'll ask others to chime in.
Sure, thanks. And yes, I think others might be more indicated to answer part of that question. But in terms of benchmarking and what we look at, because we do look at large companies, I would say one thing is that just a note is that we actually look at the largest companies within the region. So they might be multinationals, but they are based in the region, and their main sort of economic activity is within the region. But having said that, of course, the concern of the person asking the question is valid, because what we can do when we do benchmark is actually look at what companies are telling us, and it's not the whole story, of course. So what we usually do is we see the benchmarking as one part of the work that we do with companies. We also engage directly with companies to help them sort of see gaps and where they can address some of these issues more practically, and not just we measure the reporting, but what we're looking for is a change in behavior, of course. And we do see that combination of actions is what has a certain impact in terms of how these companies are changing. And maybe I'll just leave it at that and let somebody else fill in on the other parts.
Sure. No, I'm wondering if perhaps Ines wants to come back in. I see her smiling, and I know that means that she has a lot to say.
I nearly always smile, and I nearly always have a lot to say. No, thanks so much, Ida, and everyone. I think we're still far away from there. I think it's super important to do that, and we're still a bit far away from there. I think we do need to hold companies more more to account on their actual impact. I do think one way to do that is really to get more kind of bottom-up conversation, and not just necessarily from workers directly. Sometimes that's difficult. If it's possible, it is a good way. We've realized that I think we need to have more bottom-up communication also with like very local grassroots NGOs, and they really have ensure that they have channels to bring up information they have to the corporate headquarters somewhere, and kind of say, well, that doesn't really add up with your flossy or glossy annual reports, and that's the impact you actually have. So I think we need to become much stronger to kind of allow that bottom-up communication, and that we have different voices, and we don't leave it entirely to companies to tell us their story, because obviously they have their story, and sometimes they really do not know. We have had many examples, I think last year, where it was local staff who heard about issues arising through COVID, which the companies didn't realize. We had unions, very grassroots unions, who were the ones who were able to kind of come to us and say, we have an issue here, and luckily we could then kind of send this on to the people in charge. But that's obviously not always the case. That often it was just because we happened to be there a couple of months before. So we need to kind of institutionalize this and make sure that we are allowing different stakeholders to have a voice in that. I'm sure that would be helpful for you, Nina, as well, because then you can create more and more accurate benchmarking as well, because we would have this kind of bottom-up conversation. But to be honest, I do think there's grievance systems, there's some worker voice projects, etc., but we're still a little far away from making this kind of a scalable solution that really has a wide-ranging impact. So I'm ending more of a question, but I think that's somewhere where we need to go.
Thank you so much, Ines. I want to invite if there's any of the other speakers who wants to come in on this point. Larissa, yes?
Yeah, sorry, I had to change mics, but I'll just speak quickly because I know we're running out of time. But for me, there's sort of a question of how do you force the transparency? Because I think what Ines said about some companies not even knowing what's going on locally is a very real thing, and that forced transparency can happen
either consumers demanding that of companies, but really, I go back to government and policies that are forcing that. So I think of Australia's not necessarily in the region, but modern slavery has been enacted recently, and forcing those companies. Everyone now is looking back into their supply chains to see what's going on. So I think we have some companies that are forward-leading enough to do that on their own, but that's the kind of pressure I would hope we can put collectively on them.
I think if I can add
Thank
to
you
that,
so much. Yes, Kamini, go ahead.
Sorry. So I was just going to say, just to add to that, the whole element of transparency, I think it's very important, especially if you're looking at your impact evaluation system that you have. So as a company, if you are taking this step and if you are looking to be more proactive in terms of how you measure your human rights or impacts, especially your impacts on children, allowing that transparency and building a space of trust is very important, because that's when you will probably get feedback which is realistic and real, on the ground stuff. So I think that it is going to take some time, but I also feel that it really needs to come, the initiative really needs to come from the companies to see, to sort of evaluate what it is they want to see and what they want to measure, and look at means to see how they're getting that information in a very neutral and holistic way.
Thank you, Kamini. And on that note,
Ida Smith, can I add
yes,
something?
go on, KK. Yes, there's room for you to add. Yes,
Yeah.
of course, go ahead.
Yeah, I think if we look at this question from a pragmatic point of view, from a corporation, there's always this question has been coming out of the media on a regular basis. This kind of question, like a lot of companies are exploiting assessments like DJSI. Yeah. They simply just answer question. Their efforts are never verified or audited, and of course, there's this assessment can only go so far, and I think the route, the only way that we can make sure a company is actually doing what they are saying, walking the talk, is when investors are involved. Yeah. So to have an organization like UNICEF to push this kind of effort, be it sustainable development or child's right, is a right step forward. And over the years, we can see for SD, it started out like a slogan, sustainable development. People are exploiting that terms and claiming to be green and whatever. And it was kind of like a hype just maybe say a decade ago. Nowadays, it become real effort by companies. This is because investors are getting more and more focused on one thing, on actually putting the money in companies that are really ethical. So like what the panelists have said, there's still a long way to go to really be able to see the truth of a company declaring it, and to reconcile with all the goals and targets that the organizations are looking for. But I think the root cause, the drivers, the change factors eventually for businesses will come down to the investors. And I think to influence the investors is as important as influencing the consumers and the companies. The big players, people like Warren Buffett, I don't know, just to name a few. People like this, organizations like this, they play a very determining roles in this effort going forward. Whether a company is just making false claim, exploiting the assessment, exploiting a system, or are they really investing in making things better, especially in child's right. And I personally feel that the child's right is very important, because I believe out there there are people, there are parents, bosses are parents, they are somebody's uncle, and all this. There is actually a direct relation, rather than we just talking about the environment, which may, people living in a good environment, they may not feel the impact as much. So that's my take on this question.
Thank you so much, KK, and thank you to all of you. I certainly walk away both inspired and interested even in understanding more about what we can do collectively as part of an integrated approach to addressing child rights issues and impacts by business. And I want to thank each and one of you, Larissa, Nina, Kemini, Ines, Huong, Tang, who's been helping with the translation from the Center for Child Rights in Business, KK, and as well as Professor Surya. It's been absolutely amazing to have all of you on this panel, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.